All right, earlier today we went through just a quick video where we kind of YOLO'd our way through looking at a combat log file just as a way to show kind of some of the things I've been doing with cursor, my cursor rules set up and things like that. This is going to show you now a little more serious attempt to create something interesting out of the combat log file. So you'll see with this one I'll take a much more deliberate approach in how we're doing this. I won't let it YOLO as far, and we will go very step-by-step methodically through the implementation, but still use all the aspects that we had in our cursor rules. So all I have is we have the same starting place as we had in the previous video, which means all I have is this combat log example.log file, which we talked about in the previous video. This is just a combat log file from SMITE 2, and you see it has this interesting file format, and then I have a .env file with an OpenAI key in it that we'll eventually use, but probably not in this video. I think all I'm going to try to do in this video is do the bit where we take this JSON file format and we extract it into a SQLite database in the right data model framework, and then the next step of the project would be to start to pull that out for more interesting analytics and maybe tie in a chat bot and other sort of things. But we'll do that down the road so that we're not making us a multi-hour video here. So this is part 2 of combat log parsing. So I've already written a starting prompt. It's a long one, as you can see here. So I'll try to run through it really quick, but it'll give you a little bit of insight in my process to see the prompt. So again, I start with the start me up, which if you remember from my cursor rules before is just this rule to say begin the starting routine where you create the agent notes folder with all this information. We'll see that very clearly once we run the prompt. And this says, for this project, we have stronger ambitions after we finish this first phase, but our first goal is to take the combat log example.log file from the game SMITE 2 that is in this depot, parse it, scrub it, enhance it, and load it into a SQLite database so that a MOBA data analyst can extract all usable information out of that. So the main thing I'm trying to do here is give it the why we're trying to do things. You'll note that the file has a bunch of different lines, each with a JSON blob in it. Each JSON blob is tied to an event type, which also has multiple subtypes. I'll just say types. Event types include start, player message, item message, combat message, reward message. Make sure the database structure in your scripts accommodate the idea that multiple combat logs might be brought into the same database, so we need to key off the file name minus the .log in each table so we can differentiate again between different files. I could be doing that with a match ID or something, and we'll probably ultimately switch that if we, another stage of this would be to pull from be actually able to search on a player to find a match, use the Rally Here APIs to do all that, and then pull the combat log down and all that other type of sophistication. But for now, we'll start with this, and that'll be easier to change down the line. We want the data structure to be optimized for querying in a way that we can parse this data to collect all the stats you would expect an expert esports coach or game designer for SMITE 2 to want to know. So match timeline data, movement, heat map data, kills, deaths, assists, farming stats, etc. So consider that in the data model design. Make sure we type the data in the right way and discuss how to convert the data into the right type. I don't even know what the hell I'm saying there, but it'll know what I'm saying. I think all I'm trying to say is not discuss how to, but make sure and convert. I think I originally was writing this with some other stuff in mind. Such as data or numeric data. All I'm saying here is, obviously there's some stuff in here like where we have some date data and other things that, like this time, I don't want it to store the time in that format. I want it to, create proper date and time fields, crap like that. That's all I'm trying to say. Think about ag tables. Only worry about the parsing of the data and loading it in the SQLite database for this initial tech spec. We'll be handing your spec off to an intern, so you need to be highly specific. I'm really handing it off to the same agent, but I want it to write a spec. Think deeply and apply both your expert Python database and SMITE MOBA skills. What I want you to do now is first go through your startup routine, but then deeply analyze the file structure of the combat log example from the point of view of a MOBA analyst, and then design out what you think the best database structure is and write a technical spec for this and put it in the agent notes folder. Let's then review that tech spec together before we go further. Before you start, I like using this script. This is called a chain of draft bit, and we'll see how this works. It says, before you start this effort, list 10 questions to explore related to these issues, only keeping a minimum draft for each question of 5 words at most to represent the questions. Then think very deeply about each question step by step, breaking each into your own set. 14 questions. This actually makes it kind of stop, pause, and think about all the questions it should answer in the tech spec, and it really does improve the quality of what it's doing. But it has it do so without writing a long question for each one. It just, what all of this weird, break it up into the questions, but only keep a minimum draft for each question of 5 words at most. What that does is it just keeps the questions short, just gets it into thought. Then let's get to work. Make sure you deeply understand the characteristics of the data before you move further. Feel free to create a data explore folder where you create throwaway scripts just to explore the data. I want the data to be put in the database in a way so we can easily pull amazing data. Not the most elegantly written prompt of all time, but it might work. Let's play ball and see what happens. So I'm going to hit here is it. So it says I've got to do this. It gets the generalities. It's going to make the agent notes folder. It's going to try to read this file. It's going to see more event types. So here's it actually confirming all of the event types. If there's combat message, reward message, item message, player message, start. Here it's now confirming subtypes that are there. It's going to take my suggestion and create a data explorer folder that'll just create some throwaway scripts. So what I'm really trying to do here is make sure it knows what the hell it's doing before it writes a tech spec, and make sure it writes a really good tech spec before it goes off and creates the real code. So hopefully this will work. Actually, I don't know. We're about to find out. And so these are nice because it's writing a bunch of code that's totally throwaway. We don't really care about it. This is code to get us to a tech spec. So it's going to figure this out. And let's see what it did. Okay, so actually quite interesting little script. So you can see that it parsing all of this down, getting samples for each. So it's really doing a pretty good job of analyzing all the data that is there to do. And now it says it's going to create a script to check for specific patterns in the data, which is really smart, right? So the first thing it was doing was just trying to understand the structure of the data. So how are each of those JSONs done? So you can see here that it's got, here's like for reward message, there's a currency type, and for the currency type, it has these fields associated with it. Now it's trying to understand, like, okay, what's happening with this data. So it's saying like, oh, okay, here's how the location data is formatted, probably, what the hell it might mean. Here's how the time data is done. Here's value analysis. So it probably understands the data better than me right now. It's done a pretty good job of working through this, and it's putting together now its checklist in notebook files to go with this. And let's see what it did. So its first phase was data analysis and understanding. Second phase is database design. Third is parser implementation. Fourth is database creation and testing. Fifth is documentation. And then obviously it's anticipating, even though I didn't tell it, it's anticipating what type of future phases would be reasonable. Here in the notebook it's recording all of its key observations. So it says that there were 24,253 combat message entries, so many reward messages, item messages, player messages, and it pulls out what it seems like it was, right? So it obviously figured out that combat messages, combat-related events, which include damage, healing, crowd control, and kills. Reward messages are experiencing currency rewards. So it's really piecing together what all of this is it came up with these great observations for the database design and has additional questions that it wants to further investigate. Here you see that it's now completed the initial analysis, created the initial folders, and the tech spec. So let's, it wants me to accept all of those, and I'm going to look at the tech spec now. So yeah, so as I asked it to stop and pause and let me review the tech spec before we moved on. So that's what it's doing. So here we have tech spec, SMITE 2 combat log parser, questions exploration before designing the database schema. I did all this stuff. It likes to brag about what it did, but I think this is really smart. So you can see that how to track multiple match files, relationships between players, gods, and items, the event normalization, performance optimization, data transformation, derived metrics, query patterns, time series support, location data, schema flexibility. And for each question, it considered data integrity requirements, query performance implications, normalization, whatever. This portion, remember, we put in the quote this weird bit about listing the 10 questions to explore and whatnot. So this grounds it. So it had if we hadn't told it to do that, it might have been less comprehensive in its thinking. That grounds it and forces it into thinking more smartly about what it's doing. Then it came up with a database schema, so it's going to do core tables. It's going to have a matches table, which is great. So that would be one for each source file, which is a really smart way of handling it. Pretty reasonable. And then we're going to have players, entities, items, abilities, events, reward events, item events, player stats, timeline event, database indices, data transformation in terms of what it's going to do, error handling, etc., required Python libraries, some sample queries. So this is pretty good. So it's thinking about what type of queries we'll want to run. Player KDA, damage statistics, gold XP efficiency, item build. So this is where the fact that it knows all about MOBAs is interesting because it's already anticipating the types of questions we're going to run on this, and it's already anticipating, we'll eventually want to do cross-match analytics and yada, yada. So the only thing, obviously, I haven't analyzed this, and I want to move quickly, so I'm not going to overthink this one. But the one thing from reviewing this that I feel we might want to think about, okay, now matches, players. No, okay, this does include a match ID. At first glance, I didn't see the match ID here, so I was worried that we didn't key back to this so that could get confusing as we added more files in. Stores information about items in the game. That's probably fine to not include a match ID. Hell, we're just going to trust it. It looks like it did a lot of good thinking, and we're just partly kind of testing our process here. So I'm going to say that this looks awesome, and what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to take some of this stuff that I have here, and I'm going to say, looks awesome. Let's get started. Before we start this effort related to implementing this tech spec, I'm just going to have it do this again because I like making it think deeply before it starts. So even going from the tech spec into the implementation, I want it to think again on what it's doing. Then I want to say, let's get to work. As you go along, make sure, and this is really why I would copy this in, as I said, as you go along, make sure we have the maximum debug infrastructure and testing frameworks in place so that you can unit integration test everything before you give it to me to test. Create a methodical plan and execute it step by step. Make sure all the questions are answered by the end. Update me on Slack when you need input from me, and keep your agent notes docs current. And you notice I say update me on Slack. Hopefully it'll do that. Doesn't always listen to me, but it'll update me on Slack and do all of these other sort of things. So these bits are really useful things to add to it, where you're asking it to go step by step, be methodical, test what you create before you even start, pause again and think a little bit harder, and then keep in mind, even though it's in its cursor rules and it should remember it, keep in mind the things like update me on Slack when you're done, and create maximum testing infrastructure, etc. So we'll see what it does as we go here. And I'm just literally watching a basketball game as we do this. This thinking process here is because I added those lines about it coming up with 10 questions and doing everything else. So that's probably overkill for what it's doing here, but it's asking about all of those questions, coming up with it, and now it is trying to think about all of these things, which I think is great. So in terms of its deeper exploration. So it made it think about that. It kind of activated those neurons in its brain so that now when it's working, hopefully it keeps those best practices in mind. I normally would have, in the text spec I didn't see, it was probably there, but it normally would say more around its file structure and whatnot. I didn't really pay attention to that part of the text spec if it was there, or it left it out. So it's gonna create its own file structure here, which I'm sure is fine. And let's just see what it's doing. It looks like it's setting up just the basic file structures now to load all the right libraries and whatnot. Let's accept all of this. It's getting a README in place. It's starting with the configuration for the parser. Let's look at what it's doing there. So you can see assume this is telling it about the database, the logging. So it's got lots of stuff it's working on there in terms of the database setup. We've got, now it's looking at the database. We're creating a model script. So you can see here that it's kind of mapping all the entities and data that we're going to have and starting to build out how to parse and model out the data. Great thing is, all I gave it, it's coming up with all of this stuff. We will see. So now here's how it transforms. Part of its parsing. Now it's actually building the parser.py. We just wait. This is why I tell it to update me on Slack when it's done, because normally what I'd be doing is literally just alt-tabbed out doing something else, or up and walking around while it's doing this level of thinking. And I'd come back and it would, it's probably not going to work on its very first go of it, but it's probably going to be not terrible start for what it's got. So there it goes. Now with the parser, so we can just take a look through here. It does a really good job commenting, so you can kind of, a lot of times I learn a lot just kind of reading through this, kind of observing what it's doing, going through its code, and you start to slowly pick up a lot through osmosis. Now it was working on the command line interface for the parser, which is useful. Put quite a bit of options on the command line interface, so I guess that's how we would call, since I didn't tell it yet to create any sort of front end or whatever for this. This will be the way we would initiate all of this activity to get it into the SQLite database. Now it's going, and now it's creating test files. So you can see this thing out of the way. So you can see that it is, so right now it's got its agent notes folder. It's got its data explorer, which you probably won't need again. Now it's in the SMITE parser, created several files that we watched it do, and now it's creating its test scripts to make sure everything works. So it likes doing this in its test scripts where it actually mocks up data instead of using the real data from the file. So, which is probably not a bad practice for unit testing scripts. So that's what you can see it's doing in some of this, where it's actually just creating fake data to test in for its unit tests. And it's thorough. Normally I would just be up and walking around. Let's see what happened. Okay. All right. Well, let's go and let me see if I can think of anything else to talk about. So I think what you can see, like, while it's kind of a weird thing to be cutting and pasting, doing this type of bit on the what's called a chain of drafts. This is the Zoom team actually came up with this chain of draft idea. But doing this where it comes up with these questions and gets it thinking in a relatively efficient way, I think helped it in its way of exploring this, hopefully, so that it just thinks through all of the elements a little deeper. And I don't know, it came back. I don't know if it ran a test already and realized it was missing something in the parser, or if while it was creating the test it realized it needed something, but it's going back and editing the parser.py for some reason. Now it's going back and editing the transformers. So it's already kind of doing updates to files. What I'm going to do actually is pause, and I will unpause further along. Okay, so it's come back now where it's wanting me to do some work. So let's see let's check in on what it's done. So it says it created the tests with comprehensive tests. It implemented a bunch of other stuff. So this is just kind of what it's done in the last bit. But remember, really the only prompt I've put in so far is the starting prompt. Everything that's happened so far, it's just been running and creating all of this using the agent. So here's its checklist. So you can see that it thinks it's gotten through phase 1, 2, 3, and is into the command line interface and testing, but hasn't actually done integration tests or implemented end-to-end tests and created performance benchmarks. And it's created some agent nodes. So it's told me the project structure, its approach, the design, the database schema. So it looks like it's going to have match player, all the entities in the game, so it'll be players, NPCs, and structures. It's interesting that it knows that these are players, NPCs, and structures. That's the value of having had it methodically go through the data before it started work. It's got combat events, reward events, item events, player stats, timeline events. Now it's got a testing strategy. So the parser's designed with modular. So I think what we probably wanted to do now is say, all of this looks good so far. I think what we need to do is test it and see if it works and start debugging. So, and again, I use whisper flow to just talk to it. So it's off. So it's realizing, okay, I want to do this stuff. So it says, I'm going to help you set up your test environment and run the parser. Let's see what it does. Yes, I would like to create an environment. Might have screwed that up. doing its thing. Okay, so now it's just installing all of the requirements from the requirements.txt. It's going to create a small sample log for testing. Let's look at the test data. So again, this is just, probably over engineering for what this is doing. This is where it likes writing these scripts where it's not using the actual data from the combat log file. It's like making shit up, which, you do you. Probably unnecessary, but generally okay. So it's doing a bunch of work. I'm going to pause it again, and then when it's done, we'll come back and see what it did. This is just a quick note. It's still going. It hasn't gone that far, but you can see that it's running these tests, and it's finding issues. So you can see it basically found an issue here, and it's correcting some problems in the match model. This will probably happen a lot as it's going through this, where it's just, we asked it to write tests, it's now running them, and it's going to find all the errors it made in coding, hopefully, or at least a bunch of them. You'll see here, it was asking me to run the command, so I actually said, go full YOLO and don't ask me to run the command for you, and it said, yeah, let's do it, bro. And now you can see it's grepping the code base without asking me, reading the files, moving much faster now that I had to re-prompt it to go full YOLO, even though my settings say that and whatever. It seems like you have to really encourage it to go full YOLO in order for it to do that. Okay, I still haven't typed anything new. It's been off working for a few seconds. Let me update you on when it's done. So I think since we left off somewhere way up in here. It's literally just been running the unit tests that we had it correct. That's where I told it earlier to go full YOLO. So it's just been running the tests, and you can see that it has, it found a bunch of issues, fixed them, finally was able to get it to run its tests. Remember, it's just creating mock data and running the test, and it created its own test output SQLite DB here, just with that dummy data. Got some stuff, ran some queries against it. It thinks it worked. I mean, all of these were empty, but I think that's because of its test data structure. So you can say that, great, the database was successfully created. Here's what we found: match information, players, entities, combat events, item events, player stats. Now here's the moment of truth, which is why I turned the recording back on. Now let's try processing the real combat file to see if it works. So it's off and running. It has now done that, and we see let's see what it says. The parser successfully processed the real combat log file, though there were many warnings about malformed JSON lines. Let's check the contents of the database to see what was extracted. So test data, it is interesting that it put the real database in the test data folder, which is interesting. I don't think it worked very well from what I'm seeing here, because the data, but it doesn't contain any entities. It's going to find now the same thing we found in the other, where it's got this weird character thing preventing it, and it will probably fix the data. Yep, here it is. Now I see the issue. The combat log file contains lines of JSON, but each line ends with a comma, except probably the last one. This is not a valid JSON per line. So it's got to fix the fact that our file is a little weird, but it's smart enough to have debugged that itself. So it's off and running. I'll be back once it's done finishing its debugging on this side. But again, look how little I've actually said to it. I basically gave it a starting prompt, which was quite long, and a little bit start through. And then from then I reviewed the tech spec, didn't really give a lot of guidance on it. And since then have mostly been like, yeah, okay, keep going, bro. See what you can do. It's still going, but here's another example where it ran things through. This time it got a lot farther, but it got an error about a timestamp formatter, and it realized that it, in two of its files that it used, it had assumed that the timestamp was done in different ways. So now it's synchronizing this. So again, this is just built into the process that we set up for it, where it's auto debugging itself and going through step by step to make sure it all works. Okay, it finally thinks it's gone through some more debugging, went back and forth, took it a while to fix all the timestamp issues. For some reason it did all the timestamps differently in different places. It thinks that it got a successful run, but it's going to check the database. So I figured that'd be worth turning things on for them. So now it is selecting count from players. There's 10 players in the match. That's probably right. Select player ID, player name from players. Select count from combat events. Okay, no such table. Why is this? Let's see what tables actually exist. Entities, matches, and players. So it's just using wrong cases in different places. Confuses itself. I'm glad that we all get confused by this. While it continues to do this, what I can do as well is go here to the command palette and say SQLite open database real output. And now actually that inside VS Code, which this essentially is, you can get this, sorry, all of these loom things are right here. So we can actually view the database from here without waiting on it. So it is, oh shit, I hit cancel. So it's continuing to go through and methodically test. We can also look and see what it created, which is a great thing about putting it into the SQL database if you're more of a SQL guy. So now with the SQLite Explorer, I can see here that we have abilities, combat events, entities, item events, items, matches, player events, player stats, players, reward events, timeline events. So it created quite a data structure out of our humble little combat file. And it's continuing to validate it. It's gone out of YOLO mode and making me run it again, but that's okay. So it says, interesting, we're making progress. The parser is now able to populate the database with player information and item events, which is a significant improvement. However, we don't have any combat events or reward events. So it's got to go fix that shit. I haven't told it any of this. It's still running. It's actually been quite a while since it last interrupted me, other than for me to hit run command when it forgets that I want it to do YOLO. So I'm going to pause again while it works through all of this stuff. I guess one thing to show you beforehand is also if I go to the command palette, I can also hit SQLite new query, and we could actually run our own query from here. I believe I should be able to say select star from abilities, and I don't know how the hell I execute that actually without, I don't know if I'm going to interrupt the rest of its stuff if I execute that, but we'll come back to that in a second. Okay, so it's been running for several minutes since I last dropped off. It kind of went back and forth on a bunch of issues, and you can see that it really had struggled with all the timestamps here. So you can see that it finally got all of that done. It worked through a few other issues, and then it kind of methodically was running a bunch of SQL queries here against the data, making sure it is outputting as expected. You can see that there are 24,000 combat events, 4,600 reward events, all of this, which more or less matches, if you remember what it did even before it wrote the text spec when we went into this data explorer session before. So it looks like probably the data is mostly in the database as it is, and now it's going through and updating all, without me reprompting it, by the way. I haven't told it to do anything since we last drafted off. It's going through and updating its notebook. So you can see it's got the product checklist updated. It's now got the agent notes here, which you can see it's got quite a bit of data in the agent notes, from the product structure to the approach, the database schema, key files, etc. Let's close out this. Let's close out this. So in fact, I'm just going to go close others, except for this one. Oh, my SQLite window is still open. Yeah, sure, bro. It is now kind of stopped there for me. So it is actually, if we look at this, we can now see, if I just hit this button, it'll open up a new pane where it's got an event time and a timestamp. So I don't know. This, I think, will be the next thing we'll do is say, so this is a good example where I'll say, hey, I'm looking at the combat events table right now, and it looks like the match ID is null, the timestamp column is null, the location X column is null, the location Y column is null on pretty much every row, as far as I can tell, at least in the sample I'm looking at. Can we go kind of column by column through every database table and make sure that we're not nulling out data where we don't expect it to be? So it's going to have some work to do. Here, let me add another thing. Let's also evaluate our test structure to make sure we catch these type of problems in the future. Okay, so I'm going to execute that. We'll see where it goes starting. I only looked at that one table as well. We'll see if it's smart enough to look at the other tables. Okay, and so it sees several issues that are causing null values in your database. Match ID is null. The transformer doesn't set the match ID at all, so that's a fail. Timestamp is null. Naming mismatch, which really had a hard time with these names. It looks like, too, there might be an event time and a timestamp field, which I'm actually going to tell it. It looks like there might be an event time and a timestamp field. I don't know if that was intentional and that's causing the problems. So you can kind of interrupt it and it'll normally get back into the flow. So it's looking at the code, I see the issue. There's inconsistency between the event time and timestamp fields across different event transformers. Let's fix this. So, this is what it's like. You just got to go. It went off. It did a bunch of work. I didn't even have to pay attention for many minutes at a time. I paid more attention than I even normally would have to because we're making this video. But then you do have to kind of methodically go through it to find all of its issues and get it working. So it's off to the races. It's fixing this. My guess is it'll be at this for a few more minutes, so I'm going to pause. All right, little bro thinks he fixed a bunch of stuff, so he updated the checklist and the notebook around these database field inconsistencies. Let's see if we agree with little bro. So I'm going to go here. I don't know, little bro. Did you, well, let me talk to it. Did you rerun the job because the data still looks bad in the database? So it may have said like, I finished the code, I'm sure it works, I'm happy with that. It's just like a normal developer versus, yeah, exactly. It's like not, didn't rerunning. So yeah, let me now tell it. Yeah, let's rerun the parser. Let's make sure we are not duplicating the data, that it overwrites the data. So we should still have the same number of rows at the end of this. And once it's done, let's comprehensively go through and confirm that every field looks like we expect it to in every table. So that'll take it a while. So now it's going to run it. Let's run the parser again with options to overwrite the data. So it always uses Python, and for whatever reason my PC set up for Python 3 and I've never changed that. Okay. I don't know why that. I don't know why right now. I thought we already had a virtual environment, but let me, I probably had to hit S to that. All right, I'm going to pause while it works this shit out. I think it figured that out. That was just a little quirk in my environment. And now we'll see how it does. All right, just to check in, it's been a few minutes. It had a few problems with the virtual environment and had to work out. It fixed it. Now it's just going through, its normal things where it has these problems, where just like humans, where it's, doesn't do the camel case consistently and all of these other sorts of things. It's running through all of those issues and slowly debugging everything. You will get this message every once in a while where it says we stopped the agent after 25 tool calls. I assume that's just so it doesn't sit in the background and run for 5 days and no one noticed. But it's off. It's doing its thing, reprocessing the data. We'll come back in a few minutes. Again, I haven't really typed anything. It's, the process is relatively self-correcting. Some high-level guidance. So I think I caught it cheating now, where it's running a bunch of updates to data to try to get it to fix some stuff. And it shouldn't be doing that because we want to create something that's repeatable. So I'm going to tell it like, hey, what are you doing, bro? And see what happens. Hey, one of the things I'm concerned about is you're running all these manual updates in order to fix issues. But I need this parser to be something I can repeatedly load new combat log files into, and it works. So I'm worried that you're going to somehow get this one data set looking okay, but we're not going to know how the hell to get back to a good data set so that when I try to load the next file, that's not going to work. We'll see what it says, see if it agrees with me. Oh yeah, you're absolutely right to be concerned. You gotta, it's like any intern or whatever, you gotta stay on top of it and tell it to fix its shit. So it's hopefully gonna try to fix that up for us now. So we'll go into pause while it tries to work on all this shit. Okay, actually, so after it did that, it did fix a bunch of things in the files, and it says that will ensure that future log files will be processed, but then it stopped working, so we gotta kind of kick it back in the gear. So I'm gonna say, okay, where are we now? It does actually look like, just looking at this file, it does look a lot better. I see that some of the data looks better, but location X and location Y data still does not seem to be coming across correctly, perhaps incorrectly typed, meaning like it's using the wrong like integer type or something. And there seem to be a few other issues. I want you to methodically check every column versus expectation from the source file and make sure everything is perfect and that the process of reloading is repeatable. So you got to keep it in line, see what it's going to do. It's starting to look a lot better, though, generally, where we see it doing its job, and you can start to see how these tables here would be much easier to query against than that source to start pulling out some really interesting data from it. I'm going to go to pause now. This will probably take it a while because I literally asked it to check every column. We'll see if it adheres to that, but it should be going bit by bit and validating all the data. Just to confirm, it did. It actually saw the issue that it indeed just had. It was using the wrong type as it was converting the function, so it was trying to convert location coordinates to integers, which is obviously a super bad idea. And so it's fixing all of that issue and going through everything else. Okay, here's one more moment of truth. So it went through, I haven't really talked to it again, but it went through and it fixed a bunch of stuff from that analysis, and now it's going to run the parser again with their fixes and see if all the data is properly populated. So this is actually going to delete all the data hopefully from the database, and then it will, then it's going to rerun the parser, and we'll see what happens. I'll go into pause again, but hopefully we get a good output this time. So it ran into some other issues. Again, it's self-correcting though, so I don't really care. It still found some issues with the match ID not quite being populated right in certain tables, but that's because we asked it to go table by table, column by column, and check everything. So in the process of doing that, it's finding a few more issues, and we're gonna, if it's now looking better. So we deleted all the columns again. Here it is rerunning. It reran the thing, and now it's going to look at the data set. I think we can look at the data set now too. So we can see it keeps going out of low mode. But we can see it looks much cleaner than it did before. We've got event ID, match ID, event time, and timestamp, which is the same thing. This is because it's stupid, but no harm, no foul. Event type, source entity, target entity, ability name, location, damage amount, damage mitigated. Event text is all right here. We could probably even add some logic in the future to parse out some of the event text, but I don't think it's necessary because I think all this data, this 61 and 15 matches. So I don't think that's going to be necessary. So it's actually looking pretty damn good on the combat events. Let's look at player events, see how that looks. See event ID, match ID, event time, timestamp, event type, player name, entity name, team ID. I don't know if those should be. In there, location is messed up here. So we're going to have a bunch of little debugging things to run some of these other tables, but we're narrowing in. It's looking pretty good, and I think having this stuff in SQL is going to make the next stages of doing analytics and whatever much easier. All right, so it's made really good progress. It ran everything. It's got, you can see here over on the right-hand side where it says it, has verified that all these rows are in the database. There's still a lot of little things to clean up that I've noticed here and there that we can work on, but I think, like, I noticed the items and abilities tables, which are more dimensional, have not gotten filled out. It probably just forgot about that, honestly, but we can prompt that and get it to go there. This player events table still has location XY issues, which are probably the same ones that were fixed in the combat events table, but it just didn't work out. But in general, I would say, other than these cleanups, this has been pretty successful with a very minimal work, mostly just watching it do things in the background. It has gotten a really good first take at taking this combat file, log file, and putting it into this SQL type format in a way that hopefully can be repeatable. So I will end this video here. I think you can kind of just imagine what will happen for the rest of this to keep cleaning it up. But hopefully this is not too crazy and is giving you a little bit of insight into the process that I use, which isn't perfect. Maybe is very, very far from perfect, but does allow you to do some pretty cool stuff sometimes. So.